This is draft season, brought to you by Moody's, a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity. Learn more at Moody's.com. Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah. Happy holidays if you're celebrating anything else. For the folks out there, everyone, welcome to draft season, the holiday edition. Just so you guys are aware, we're recording this on the Monday before Christmas Eve. It's airing on Thursday, so if there's any other big announcements coming your way the next couple of days that we don't touch on it, that's why. I am John Schmeelk, joined as always by Tony Pauline from Sports Kita. Tony, Merry Christmas, my friend.
Same to you and your family, John, and same to our viewers. Happy Hanukkah. And as you mentioned, this is taking place. We're recording this the day before Christmas Eve, which is December 23rd. So I got to say, happy Festivus to all of those people out there who celebrate Festivus. The airing of grievances has already commenced, and they will be extended for a year for the New York football fans.
The aluminum pole is out. Let's rock and roll. Good call, Tony. All right, let's get to it. Before we get to the college football playoffs, we'll talk about those games. We'll preview next week's games because next week's episode is going to be recorded and airing next Thursday on January 2nd after those games are played, so we can react to the second round of the college football playoffs and the rest of the bowl games, too. We're going to have some bowl games in that area as well. So we'll do all that in today's show, Tone. I'm very pumped up about it. It'll be good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot to talk about.
Yeah, all right. So let's get to this first. Declarations. Anything jump out at you over the last week since we last spoke?
Well, I think the only thing that I really saw is Patrick Payton, the pass rusher from Florida State, who had a terrible year, like most people. The entire program at Florida State is not going to enter the draft. He's going to transfer to LSU, which I think is the best move. I mean, coming into the season, many of us thought Patrick Payton had top 45, if not top 32 potential. He was disastrous right from the get-go. Jim Nagy brought that point up the first time we had him on. I mean, if he entered the draft, he's a late-round pick, but he's got early-round potential. So not only does he decide to stay a year, but he transfers to LSU to a better conference. Good for Patrick Payton. I think that's the best move he could make.
All right, Tony. It was a ho-hum. Watch the first half of these games and then figure out what else you got to do with your holiday weekend type of college football playoffs. Obviously, we stuck through them to talk about some of the prospects in these games, but for what I would consider non-competitive games, Clemson, Texas was probably the closest thing that you had to a game that really was in some question in the second half, though Texas ends up winning 38-24. Well, let's go in the order in which these games were played. Indiana Notre Dame was last Friday night, Tony. And Notre Dame just kind of beat Indiana at their own game, right? Run the ball, play defense, and they were just the more physical, and they won up front, and Indiana just could not get anything going offensively.
I think the Indiana-Notre Dame game set the tone for all four games, and that is what we saw on paper happened on the field because there were some big mismatches in these contests. And it was just, I thought for Indiana, SMU, the moment was just too big for them. I mean, the Fighting Irish, Notre Dame expects to go into each season fighting for a national title. Now, they haven't done that for a while, but they expect to. Where Indiana, they deserve applause. It was a great season, but this was sort of the cream of the crop. And, as you said, a lot of excitement. Indiana gets that turnover early in the game. They're going into the end zone. And then Curtis Rourke throws a pick to Xavier Watts, a bad pass. Xavier Watts, I mentioned that matchup, and it was all downhill from there. I mean, Notre Dame offensive line just pounded Indiana. Indiana's offensive line could not contain Notre Dame, which was a problem for them against Michigan. It was a slight problem against Ohio State. Listen, it shouldn't surprise anybody. Notre Dame was the much better team. And I think you got to start with Riley Leonard, who had a good game. He wasn't great. He played within the system. He was efficient. He was methodical. 23 of 32, 201 yards, one touchdown, one INT, although that was on a tip pass, 30 yards rushing on one TD. When you watch Riley Leonard, and again, we talked about Riley Leonard with Jim Nagy the second time he was on, when we were talking about the Senior Bowl invites, you could see the athleticism. You could see the arm strength. You could see the ability to make all the passes. It's just a matter of going from athlete with a big arm to a passer, and I think he's starting to do that. He wasn't great, but he did what Notre Dame needed him to do.
No, I'm with you 100%. Let's talk about the other quarterback then, Curtis Rourke, Tony. He's a guy that was a transfer, obviously, 20 of 33, 215 yards, 2 touchdowns a pick. Efficient. That interception hurt. Those red zone interceptions always do. But I look, I think he's a guy that profiles, if he figures things out, could be a backup quarterback in the NFL and kind of play that role for a real long time as a day 3 pick.
Marvelous year. I mean, despite the fact that he had the bad interception, did a great job all season protecting the ball for Indiana. Really ran that offense efficiently. Was huge in getting Indiana to where they are, where they were, into the playoffs. We're going to see him at the Shrine Bowl. I agree with you. I think with Curtis Rourke, he's a real good game manager. He protects the football. He's got it going on between the ears. What I'm going to look at the Shrine Bowl is, does he have the downfield arm? Can he let it fly? Are the downfield passes, arriving to the receiver with speed? But he had a terrific year. I'm sure he didn't want it to end this way, because early on you could see that he was off. But he's definitely elevated his draft stock. I mean, last year, 2 seasons ago, he entered as a senior at Ohio with potential late round grades. Didn't have a great 2023 season at Ohio. Was injured part of the time. Played much better this year. So he's moving towards the draft process with elevated draft grades, no doubt about it.
And it's funny, a lot of this big picture, and then we'll hit some of the other Notre Dame players. There was some complaints from people out there about how, they didn't take strength of schedule into consideration enough. You have these conference winners, the winners of the Big 12, winners of the ACC. Indiana, I think their best win was against the 7th best team in the Big 10, something like that, right?
Well,
and
beat Michigan. They beat Michigan, which is a pretty significant win.
And Michigan was like the 4th or 5th in the conference this year, something like that.
Yeah, Michigan was not very good this year.
Right, you're right. That no question a quality win. But I don't know if they had any way around this, the committee, right? Like, you have to reward teams for winning games, but I think the concept of the critics was correct. Like, if you have Ole Miss in one of these games, would they have been more competitive than, say, Indiana? You know what? Probably. But if you're going to do a playoff system, you have to reward winning games and winning divisions despite the strength of schedule deal. Even though I think in this first round, the teams you worried about their strength of schedule, they ended up struggling in some of these games.
Listen, you play the schedule that's put in front of you. Indiana was a one-loss team. That one game they lost to Ohio State. They lost pretty badly, although they were in that game for most of the first half until 2 special teams blunders late in the first half. But I got no problem with Indiana, who was 11-1, being in the college football playoffs. Considering where they came from, I know that doesn't factor into it, but still, a one-loss team out of the Big Ten, where you got Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State in the college football playoffs, and they beat Michigan. There should be no problem with that at all.
I agree 100%. You can only beat the teams that are on your schedule in front of you, right? I'm with you. All right, Notre Dame, Tony, want to go one other offensive player here before we jump to the defense. And I know he's not draft eligible yet, but he had a big game. Jeremiah Love, their running back, had that really big run in the game. Is he a guy that we'll be talking about as potential running back one next year? He's Julian Love, former Giants' younger brother, by the way, for the people that did not know that. What's the buzz around him? Have you even talked to anybody about him?
Yeah, well, we'll be talking about him. He keeps ripping off 96-yard touchdown runs like he did the first play after that interception.
98, right? Was it 98 or was it 96? I think it was 98.
It may have been 98. I mean, I'd be wrong.
Don't take 2 yards away from the kid. It's Christmas time, Tony.
It was long, that's for sure. I mean, no one's really talked about him in the scouting community because he's not draft eligible. I'm not hearing, there's no buzz about, wow, we can't wait for this guy to become draft eligible. I want to say an Anthony Hill, the linebacker from Texas. But listen, I mean, obviously somebody to keep an eye on.
No question about it. All right, let's go to the defensive side of the ball for Notre Dame. You already mentioned the Xavier Watts pick. He was one of the guys you wanted to keep an eye on this game.
10 tackles, 1 interception. I mean, he is just a smart, efficient safety. Not going to be an early draft pick unless he tests off the charts. I don't think that's going to happen. You're looking more as a 3rd or 4th round prospect. But still, plenty of, early day 3 safeties go on to start in the NFL. I think he's more of a zone type of safety. I don't know that he's a traditional free safety, but just smart, instinctive, does the little things well, and comes away with the big plays. That was the big matchup I was looking for against Curtis Rourke. And obviously, right off the bat, Xavier Watts came off the winner.
Yeah, and it was just an overthrow, right? And Watts was kind of he threw it a little too far ahead on the crossing pattern, and Watts was in the right place at the right time to grab that pick. Couple defensive linemen for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, and 2 sons of former Giants as well. R.J. Oben, former Giants lineman Roman Oben's son, had a tackle in the game. And then Howard Cross III had a tackle and a pass breakup. But they played, and I thought Notre Dame line played a lot better than maybe the numbers might dictate.
Yeah, very explosive. I mean, they got a lot of pressure, which I think really hurt Curtis Rourke, and they were occupying the blockers well, which allowed for those blitzes to be effective. It's funny because they play a three-man line, but most of these guys, especially Oben and Howard Cross, are more one-gap defensive players, whether it be the one-gap defensive end, one-gap defensive tackle. The bigger guy, Riley Mills, he's also, if you're going to put him at defensive tackle, he's about 300 pounds, so he's more of a one-gap defensive tackle. Maybe you stick him at defensive end in a three-man line if you can put some weight on him. Did hurt his knee in that game, and the most latest reports are Riley Mills is out for the rest of the college football playoffs.
Oh, is that true? I didn't hear that. That's too bad.
Yeah.
It looked like he had a chance to maybe, he was still in uniform. They thought maybe he
Yep.
had a chance to come back into the game, but they're saying he's not going to return now.
Literally 10 minutes before we started recording, I read that he's out for the rest of the college football playoffs. We'll see how that affects his decision to enter the draft if he has any eligibility left. But he's the bigger guy. He's the bigger of the three. He's got the most growth potential. He's the hard. All these guys are hardworking. The motor is always always running for them. And I think they're all, mid to late day three selections, but they'll have a place on Sunday.
All right, let's go to the game that Notre Dame's going to be playing next week. I'm not sure if they're New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. I haven't looked at the schedule yet, Tony. But Georgia, and these are the games where Notre Dame, they look great. They're beating all these teams. They're an independent. They're not in a conference, obviously. Then they play an SEC team. You're like, oh, there's the talent differential. Are we, do you think, going to see that again this week when they take on Georgia?
There's definitely a talent differential, and Notre Dame's really going to have to step it up as well as they played against Indiana. This is a completely different ball of wax. I mean, you start off with Riley Leonard. I mean, number one, he's going to have Jalen Walker and Michael Williams, both potential first-round picks breathing down his neck. And then he's got to keep an eye out for Malachi Starks, who is a first-round pick. Some people think he's a top 10 prospect. So for Riley Leonard, we went from methodical game manager, which he did so well against Indiana. Now there's going to be a lot more on his shoulders, and it's going to be a lot more uncomfortable for him with the way George is able to rush the passer with two great NFL prospects. And then when he puts the ball up, he's got one of the best safeties we've seen in a long while, who's also a ball hawk who can also play over the slot receiver, trying to defend the pass. So from that aspect, it's a large differential in talent. Notre Dame's got, and especially Riley Leonard's got to step it up.
And then on the other side, how does the Notre Dame defensive line stop that Georgia rushing attack? Well, let's start with this. Have you heard anything on Carson Beck and his availability? What are they saying about him?
From what I've read, they are expecting to be without Carson Beck for most of the playoffs. Now, again, go back two of our shows ago with Jim Nagy when he was talking about the elbow injury. And then last week, I had mentioned that when I talked to people, they said it's really bad. From what I'm hearing, Georgia is at least preparing to be without Carson Beck the next 3 weeks, assuming they get that far.
Which means Tony, to your point, they're going to lean a lot on the run game then, right? So how does this Notre Dame defensive line, we kind of just talked about these guys, right? Yeah. How do they hold up against that Georgia offensive line and Trevor Etienne in that running attack?
Yeah, I mean, the Georgia offensive line is bigger. They're more physical, and they're much more talented than the Indiana offensive line. Not trying to offend the Indiana offensive line, but when you look at Tate Rutledge, you look at Xavier Truss, who's been up and down this year, Dylan Fairchild. I mean, these guys will be able to handle that, or should be able to handle that, the Notre Dame defensive line, just with body positioning and strength alone. And the fact that Riley Mills is not going to play, I mean, that's really going to hurt Notre Dame. Oben Jr. and Howard Cross III better be on their game because this Georgia offensive line, although it's struggled at times this year, and I don't think it's played up to expectations, when they are on their game, they were big, tough, next level type of blockers.
All right, let's jump to SMU Penn State. Penn State destroying SMU in this game, 38-10. You had those two pick sixes earlier, right? If I remember correctly in this game. And then Penn State really didn't have to do a ton offensively the rest of the way, to be completely honest with you. So quiet game for Drew Aller. He didn't really have to do much, Tony. He just threw 22 passes, completed 13 of them for 127 yards. His big tight end, Tyler Warren, 4 catches, 33 yards. Because, again, you got those defensive scores. You didn't have to do a whole lot in this game with the football.
And they also rushed for, I believe, almost 200 yards. Their top two backs were close to 200 yards. I may be off on that, maybe 150 yards. So you're right. I mean, Alar was sort of like a Riley Leonard to a lesser extent, just managed the game, was methodical. The SMU, again, the significantly overmatched. And just like Indiana, I think that the moment was bigger than what they were ready for, although they deserve to be they deserve the credit being there, winning the ACC during the regular season and then going down to Clemson. But I mean, you look at their roster, they have few NFL prospects. Now, Kobe, the safety I talked about, was basically non-existent. And like you said, early on, it was SMU mistakes that put Penn State ahead. There was no way SMU was going to come back. I was impressed with some of the second tier and even third tier Penn State defenders who came up, who stepped up their game. Cody Izzard, the explosive defensive tackle, 5 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss. He's a guy who 2 years ago really caught my attention during my summer film work. I had him in my database. This game never really took off. Scouts are talking about him as a street free agent. He's a 4th-year senior, probably can come back for another year, but he's a bigger guy who moves very well. He just has to play at a high level on an every snap basis. Kobe King, the solid linebacker, 8 tackles. Danny Dennis Sutton, got to keep an eye on for the future. An edge rusher for Penn State, 4 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks in the game. Really helped the Penn State defense set the tempo of that contest.
And by the way, Kobe King, twin brother, which I did not realize, of Kalen King, who is currently the corner. He's actually on the Packers right now, who had a rough post-draft process last year, but second brother we've had mentioned in this podcast today. It's a family affair. It's the holidays. It makes sense, Tony. And let's look ahead. Penn State, Boise State. You mentioned some of those up front defenders for the Nittany Lions. Well, they're going to have their hands full because here comes Ashton Jeanty, who's been the best offensive player in college football this year, runner-up in the Heisman Trophy. No one's been able to tackle this guy all year long. He's broken all sorts of rushing records. He's been phenomenal. He's going to have to carry the ball and the weight and the offense and everything else for Boise State if they want a chance to beat Penn State this week.
And they're going to have to switch it up with Ashton Jeanty. I mean, if they try and run down the teeth of that Penn State defense, it's not going to work because I think that Penn State defense is just going to eat them up. They're going to have to try for some perimeter runs and hope that Jeanty can beat the Penn State defenders around the corner. He is a good perimeter runner. He is a good pass catcher out of the backfield. He's a 3-down back. He's a triple threat player, at the position. They're going to have to mix it up, but they're still going to be up against it. I mean, again, this is one of the rankings that you wanted because you knew that Boise State was going to be one of the easier second-round games, despite the fact that they had such a sensational season. We talk about Ashton Jeanty. Keep an eye out on their left tackle, Casey Cage, redshirt sophomore. I have him right now as a 4th, 5th round type of prospect. Obviously, there's room for growth there, but see how he does against Abdul Carter, who I'm sure is probably licking his chops. He's going to try and beat the younger guy, and how he does run blocking. If you're looking for one guy on defense who could maybe disrupt Drew Alar from the Boise State point of view, Ahmad Hassanian, 8.5 sacks. He's more of your undersized edge rusher, very quick up the field. It's only about 245 pounds, so if they run right at him, he may have some struggles, but that's a guy that has the ability at least to disrupt Drew Allar's game plan.
Yeah, out of Cairo, Egypt. You don't see that very often on the old player page, right? So we'll keep an eye on him. I'm curious to see because I've seen a couple places that have his height and weight at different. I saw a 6'3", 270 in one spot, so I'll be curious to see where he actually weighs in. Some of these schools, they can pump up sometimes the height weight stuff, so we'll have to see how he weighs in. But yeah, 8.5 sacks this year and 12.5 sacks last year too. So he's a guy that's had a couple of years of production here, and we'll see how he does in this game and as we head towards the draft. Game number 3, Tony, Clemson, Texas. Texas won that game 38-24. Clemson goes right down on their first drive. Yeah. They score that touchdown. You think, oh, maybe we got a game here. And then all of a sudden I'm flipping back and forth. That was on the same time as I believe the Ravens-Steelers game, if I'm not mistaken, on Saturday. So I was trying to keep an eye on Ravens-Steelers a lot because that was such an important game for the AFC North. I turn it back and all of a sudden Texas has a commanding lead in this game.
Yeah, I mean, Clemson, Antonio Williams, the wide receiver, who's a day 3 pick, 4 receptions for 66 yards and a touchdown. Jake Bringingstool, the big, tall, lanky tight end, number 9. You can't miss him on film.
6'6", really 240. Looks good.
4 receptions for 69 yards. I think he's kind of he did not have the season that scouts expected, and he's gone from a potential 3rd-round pick to the 5th round. Wade Wadaz, the middle linebacker, a lot of people don't talk about. He is a draftable prospect, 8 tackles. I mean, again, Texas on paper, had the decided advantage. And after that first drive, they came through. I do think that, we've talked about Quinn Ewers. We haven't talked about him glowingly. And when you look at Cade Klubik versus Quinn Ewers in this game, they were basically neck and neck. And I mean, Cade Klubik is a late round pick at best. He's probably not going to even get drafted. And Ewers really wasn't able to take advantage of it. I do like Jahdae Barron. We've talked about him a couple times, the defensive back, cornerback from Texas that can play corner. He can play nickel, had 2 pass breakups.
5 interceptions this year for him. He's gotten his hands on the ball a lot this season.
He's a smart, tough defensive back. And then you look at that Texas defensive line, Barron Sowell, who's going to be at the Senior Bowl, 3 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1 sack. I have him as a 3rd-round pick. Ethan Burke, the underclassman, the other defensive end, basically the same numbers. And Alfred Collins, a 5th-round defensive tackle, had 4 tackles. A lot of talent on that Texas defensive line that doesn't get talked about too much because everybody concentrates on their offense, and they had a lot of guys like Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy who left last year, but they still have some draftable prospects on that Longhorn defensive line.
Yeah, we'll see about Antonio Williams, the wide receiver out of Clemson. You mentioned him, 4 catches, 66 yards at a touchdown, 5'11", 190, redshirt sophomore. So we'll have to decide whether or not he wants to come out in this draft. And what's not a top-heavy wide receiver group, but it is deep, like the wide receiver position is every year. It's always deep, right? So we'll see what his decision is. You mentioned Cade Klubnik, 26 of 43, 336 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. Really strong numbers. Yours in this game. They ran the ball so well, Texas. I want to get your take on their running backs, just because they're so productive, Tony. Yours was 17 of 24, 202 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 pick. But Texas, they just ran the ball in this game an awful lot. I'll bring up the numbers here very quickly just so we're on the same page and the fans know who we're talking about here. But in this game, you had Blue, who had 14 carries for 146 yards in this game. He ran it all over the place, and it wasn't just him. They spread the ball around. That was Jadon Blue, and then they had Quintrevian Wisner, who had 15 carries for 110 yards, 7 yards a carry for Wisner, 10 yards a carry for Blue. Texas just dominated this game on the ground.
Yeah, and first it starts with the offensive line. They got an outstanding offensive line. We talked about Cameron Williams, the right tackle. We talked about Kelvin Banks, but they've got some good players on the interior. Now, Jaden Blue, who's an underclassman, I think he's a middle round pick right now. Be interesting to see what he does because he's the number 2 back on that depth chart. Depending on how far Texas advances to the college football playoffs, does he enter the draft? Does he considering, transferring to another school? But I think right now you're looking at a middle round pick as far as Wisner's concerned. Wisner's a true sophomore, so we got to wait on him.
Yeah, no question about it. But good players. And Texas, once again, one of the most talented teams in the college football playoffs. They have a chance to win it all if they can put it all together, and yours continues to play well. All right, Tony, let's move on to Texas and Arizona State. They take on one another in round 2 of the college football playoffs. Your thoughts on that game?
Yeah, in the Peach Bowl, and like Penn State, this was the other bracket that you wanted to be in because you've got Arizona State, who I believe at the end of the year was ranked number 15 when they won the Big 12 championship, but got in by virtue of winning the Big 12 championship.
And they blew out Iowa State in that game, too. They hammered them.
At Iowa State, who's a pretty good team. Now, I mean, on paper, Texas should win this game by 35 points, but they don't, that's why they play the game. And Arizona State is an incredibly well-coached team. They've been behind the 8 ball before, and they consistently come through. If you're looking for a couple of guys to watch, you got to watch Max Anchor, their big right tackle, against those Texas defensive ends, Barron Sowell and Ethan Burke, who I just mentioned. I mean, you look at Ian Anchor. I mean, he just looks like an NFL offensive lineman. He's got that big, thick lower body. He moves relatively well. Came into the season with free agent grades. Some scouts have him as early as the 4th round right now. So that'll be a matchup to watch. And then, of course, Cam Scatterbo, who was just announced as accepting his invitation to the Senior Bowl. Well, the tough interior running back, transfer from Sacramento State. You mentioned that the Iowa State game, how they handled Iowa State. I think Scatabo had, 166 yards rushing in that game. Runs around players, runs through players, carries the pile. We're going to see him at the Senior Bowl. Kind of reminds me of, and this is going to be a name that a few people may remember, Brian Leonard of Rutgers, the way he was just a big, powerful ball carrier who kind of invited contact, looked to take on and punish the opponents. That's the kind of player that Scatabo is, and it's worked out well for Arizona State.
Yeah, just very low to the ground, compact, right, but very strong, good contact balance. He's not going to wow you on the 40, Tony, but he knows how to play the position. So he'll have to play well if the Arizona State wants a chance to beat Texas in the Peach Bowl. All right, final game from the weekend. Ohio State just comes right out throwing the ball. I like to see Ryan Day be aggressive, getting the ball out to Jeremiah Smith, someone that we're going to have to wait 2 more years for. It's going to be a long wait because he's a heck of a player. But Ohio State just dominating Tennessee in this game, Tony.
Yeah, from the word go, Ryan Day, Chip Kelly as well, who's the much maligned offensive coordinator there, and especially coming off of that Michigan game where they were just terrible offensively, couldn't get anything going. I think, number one, in the preview last week, I talked about the interior of that Tennessee defensive line kind of, trying to employ that same sort of Michigan game plan and take advantage of the weakness of that Ohio State offensive line. Omar Norman Lott, the defensive tackle, Bryson Easton, Omari Thomas combined for 2 tackles and 1 tackle for loss. So obviously, Ohio State offensive line came into the game with a chip on their shoulder after that Michigan game. They knew what was going to happen, and they did a great job protecting Will Howard. They did a terrific job for the running game. I mean, Donovan Jackson, I thought, did a real good job on James Pierce, who I'll get to in a second. Pierce had 3 tackles and 2 tackles for losses. But really, there was not a lot of pressure on Will Howard, and that was because of that offensive line. It's going to be interesting when you look at James Pierce because a lot of people had him graded as a top 5 player. His pass rushing numbers off the 2023, but he's thin. He doesn't seem to have a lot of growth potential, but he is incredibly athletic, and he made a lot of athletic.
I'm sorry, Tony. He reminds me of almost like Nick Benito types, right? Who was super productive and athletic, but he's just small. Right, yeah. He's thin. Can he figure out how to be more than just like a situational pass rusher? Because he can rush the passer. There's no question about it. I just don't know what his size and frame. He's like 240 pounds. We'll see what he weighs in at I'm sure he'll be drinking water like crazy before he gets on the scale at the combine. But he's a guy that just does not have a huge frame, but he does know how to get after the quarterback.
Well, go back to what my conversation with Jim Nagy about Ty Robinson, the Nebraska defensive line, and how they line him up on the inside and the outside at nose tackle. They move him around. That's what a defensive coordinator is going to have to do with James Pierce. I mean, put him up, put his hand in the ground on occasion, line him up in space, have him drop back off the line of scrimmage because he has that athleticism. A zone blitz, have him stand over tackle. I think he'll be able to do it. I think it's more important that a defensive coordinator allows him to do it rather than just kind of segments him as an edge rusher because he is so athletic. You mentioned the freshman receiver from Ohio State, Emeka Buka, had a real good game. 5 receptions, 81 yards, nothing outstanding, but just very solid. Does the little things well. I like the route discipline. Just stay disciplined with his routes. And if the ball wasn't thrown in his direction, well, there was a receiver that was open underneath him because of the fact that, he wasn't being selfish with his routes. Again, Abuka, I like him as maybe a late second, early third round choice. Some people have him in the first round. I just don't see it with him. I think he's a nice complementary receiver, which is what he's been at Ohio State the past couple of years. But he had a real good game. And I got to tell you, I know everybody loves Quinshon Judkins at Ohio State, but Trayvon Henderson, he's going to be underdrafted. I don't know if he's going to end up in day 2. He's just a terrific all-around back. What do you have? 80 yards on 10 carries in the game with 2 TDs, 4 receptions for 54 yards. He's explosive. He's creative. He's an outstanding pass catcher out of the backfield. And I think what's going to happen with Trayvon Henderson, because of the fact he's had some injuries in the past, and then they brought in Quinshon Judkins with that nice NLI deal, so he kind of had to share carries again this year. Somebody's going to get a real steal with Henderson, probably, if not late day 2, somewhere in the 4th round of the 2025 NFL draft.
Yeah, boy, Ohio State has the perfect running back combination, right? Henderson's kind of there receiving threat, their perimeter player, things like that, while Quinshawn Junkins is kind of their between the tackles guy. He does a lot of the dirty work. He was 10 carries, 34 yards, and 2 touchdowns in this game. By the way, Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants, uniting the brightest minds to turn today's risks into tomorrow opportunities. Learn more at Moody's.com. Moody's, proud partner of the New York Football Giants. And then you had the usual cast of characters on defense, Tony, that we talked a lot about this year. And the defensive backs, the corners actually had a nice little game for Ohio State.
No mental breakdowns, no lapses, didn't give up any big plays. Now, a lot of that had to do with the pressure that Ohio State got up front, which I'll get to in a minute. But still, I thought both starting cornerbacks and even their nickel backs and safeties played very, very well, protecting against the big playability of Tennessee. That will bode well for Burke and the other kid, Ebezuman, if he enters the draft, because both of those guys have had a difficult season. Up front, I was really impressed with Tyleik Williams. I mean, he only ended with 3 tackles, but he caused a lot of mayhem. And it was his pressure and his ability to penetrate the line of scrimmage that created opportunities for his teammates multiple times, just blowing up plays. And the quarterback had to move his feet or leave the pocket because he penetrated the line of scrimmage. Not the biggest guy in the world, but explosive, very quick, very athletic. JT Tuimoloau, 8 tackles. 2.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, had a real nice game. Jack Sawyer, 5 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. Both had a nice game. We know these guys can rush the passer, but the criticism, and I think justifiably so, was they were hit and miss for most of the years. And I think most of the season. And I think because of that, what went on in that Michigan game, I think because of Tyleik Williams, those guys really stepped it up. Tuimoloau is going to be a real interesting guy to scout moving forward, because when he's on his game, he is just incredibly explosive and he is tough to stop, but he's not on his game all the time. It's hit and miss with him. Jack Sawyer kind of reminds me of Anthony Anzalone, the linebacker from Detroit, in the sense that, he's a guy who's not the greatest athlete in the world, but wow, I mean, he's just go, intense. I think he's going to be drafted a little bit later than what people think, 4th round, maybe early 3rd round. But like James Pierce, if you get a good defensive coordinator who's creative, who knows how to use him, he's going to be a real good Sunday player.
All right, and then when you have the game next week, and this is the premier second-round game, at least in my opinion, Tony, Ohio State, Oregon in the Rose Bowl. This is a game that the winner of this team could very well win the national championship and win, or are they still calling it the national championship, or is it the college football playoffs champion, whatever the heck they're calling it. And there's some really good matchups, starting with the Ohio State pass rush against 2 Oregon offensive tackles and offensive linemen I know you're a big fan of.
Yeah, the premier game at the Premier Bowl. I mean, the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all. You have two Big Ten teams, although it's the Big 14 now, in a matchup that usually last year would have been the Pac-12 against the Big Ten, which is what the Rose Bowl always was.
Quite synergistic, Tony. And I wonder if they designed it that way on purpose, to be honest with you.
I thought about that, although that would have been very tough. Obviously, putting Oregon in that slot, made it easy. But I think the rest of the settings of the brackets and the rankings of the teams, and then, and trying to hope or ensure that Ohio State was going to beat Tennessee, which they did rather handily, would have been a tough thing to do. That did cross my mind. But getting back to the game, Josh Connerly, the left tackle, I've espoused my love for him. I think he's going to be a late 1st-round pick, maybe not as a tackle, but potentially as a zone blocking guard. And Ajani Cornelius, who began his college career at Rhode Island, the big right tackle for Oregon, who projects as a mid-day 3 pick, probably in the 5th or 6th round, going against that Ohio State pass rush, the JT Tuimoloau and the Jack Sawyers, who we just talked about. I mean, the Ohio State guys have got to step it up, because both of these Oregon offensive linemen are real, real good. And then when you're going to flip that around. Talked about how well the Ohio State offensive line played against Tennessee. Well, now it's next level against Jordan Birch of Oregon, against Derek Harmon of Oregon, the big or the explosive interior defensive tackle, and Jamari Caldwell, a potential late-round pick who doesn't get a lot of mention. I mean, there are going to be battles whenever the teams are on the field offensively, both teams. There's going to be great battles on both sides of the line of scrimmage.
And that's up front, Tony. And then we have great battles between 2 of the better sets of wide receivers in college football, with Oregon's wide receivers, Evan Stewart, Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden, against some good and highly valued Ohio State defensive backs. And then you have the Ohio State receivers we already talked about will test the Oregon corners and safeties.
And remember, obviously these teams know each other because they played early in the year. I believe it was the fourth, fifth game of the year in
Good game
early
too.
October.
Excellent game.
Oregon won by a point. That is when Josh Simmons, the left tackle for Ohio State, went down with the season-ending knee injury. That was also a game where Evan Stewart really did a good job. Really had his way against that Ohio State secondary. So, the lapses that we didn't see and the ability to stop and defend against the big play ability that Tennessee posed, that the Ohio State defensive backs were able to stop on Saturday, well, you're going to have to multiply that by at least two, because these receivers are better. They're much more explosive. They're more consistent, and they're productive on a week in and week out basis. Evan Stewart, notwithstanding, we've talked about his ups and downs, but this is going to be a real battle and a real challenge for the Ohio State secondary. The Oregon secondary doesn't get a lot of mention, but they're solid. Jabbar Muhammad, a smaller guy who transferred from Washington last year. You mentioned Cam Alexander, Tysheem Johnson, against what could be, or what has shown to be when they're on their game, and the quarterback is on the game, a very potent receiving duo at Ohio State.
All right, and then finally, who are some of the guys on Oregon you'll be keeping an eye on their offense?
Yeah, Ohio State defense, it doesn't stop just with the receivers that you mentioned. I mean, they're going to have an answer for Dillon Gabriel, a guy who really doesn't get much mention. I think is underrated in the scouting community. I like him as a day 3 pick. He's got a lot of Baker Mayfield in his game if you watch him, an RPO quarterback who can play from the pocket, who can get outside the pocket, make plays with his arms, who can make plays with his legs. He's smart. He protects the football. He's always in command of the game. When you go back to that Big Ten title game, when it was 3rd and long and it looked like Penn State was going to turn the tide of the game, Dillon Gabriel had an answer, and Dillon Gabriel has consistently had an answer for him. And if it's not Dillon Gabriel, it's Jordan James, their explosive running back, not the biggest guy in the world, but he's impossible to tackle.
He's a good back, man. The more I watch him, Tony, he's a good player.
He's got to burst through the hole. He makes defenders miss. He picks up yardage off initial contact. He's good around the corner. He's got great vision on the inside. So that's going to have to be somebody that they watch out for. And then Terrence Ferguson, the tight end, not really a big play tight end athletically, but he's smart. He plays within the system, good blocker, and will find the open spot down the field and make big plays as a pass catcher. So the Ohio State defense, it's got a lot to they're going to be up against it a lot, because Oregon can hit you in a variety of ways, which is why they're undefeated, and they are the number 1 team in the nation.
All right, I think this is a coin flip game. I'll close with you on this before I ask you a question about the holidays. So, do you think we get one upset in either Penn State going up against Boise, Texas going up against Arizona State, or Notre Dame going up against Georgia? I haven't looked at the spreads in those games. I don't know what they are. I'm sure the teams we expect to be favorites are fairly big favorites. Do you think we'll get an upset in one of those 3 games?
I doubt it. I mean, most of the nation's going to be rooting for Boise. A lot of people are going to be rooting for Arizona State. There are a lot of people just root against Notre Dame because they don't like Notre Dame. But I think Georgia, I think Penn State, and I think Texas are going to win handily.
Yeah, and then we'll see Ohio State, Oregon. That'll be a big game. Though they say Ryan
I think let me say this: the Ohio State Oregon game, Will Howard has played well against Tennessee. He's going to have to play better against Oregon. If Will Howard can protect the ball, if he can hit the receivers accurately, then I think Ohio State has got a chance to win.
So what do you got, Tony? Are you hosting Christmas or Christmas Eve? What are you doing?
Well, being of Italian heritage from New York, Christmas Eve is the big holiday in our house. If you're in the area, we've got 20 people. In fact, I was up this morning at 6:45. I had to run to the seafood place before anybody got there to get the Jonas crab claws. And
how many fishes? 7 fishes?
Well, we call it 7 fishes, but it's usually about 8 or 9. I now just call it the $1,000 dinner because it's getting more expensive by the year. But yeah, it's called 7 fishes. We usually end up with about 8. People bring this, people bring that, but it's a lot of fun here at the Pauline household Christmas Eve. That's for sure.
Yeah, we're hosting too. So my brother and my sister with their families will be coming over. We do We do some Swedish meatballs. We do some spicy turkey meatballs. My sister brings like deli finger sandwiches, and my brother usually brings like a big ziti or a lasagna, and we kind of just have like a kind of hang out, eat a little bit. We don't do like an official sit down dinner. It's kind of grab as you go and eat as you open presents and all that sort of stuff. So it should be a fun night.
See, we do both. We're first the appetizer. Everybody comes for the appetizers, grabbing and then we have the sit down dinner, as you would expect in Italian fashion.
Do you have any little kids coming to your house, or mostly adults?
No, all the little kids are grown up. I mean, we used to have a lot of little kids, but they're all. My daughter's the littlest, and she's about 21. So no, I guess we got to wait for the next generation to have their little kids before. And it was fun. I mean, it was fun with the little kids because there were enormous amounts of presents, and now everybody gets gift cards and tickets to Ranger games and things like that.
Yeah, we have my three nephews, believe it or not. Two of them are in college. One's going and then we have one's going in a couple years. He's a junior in high school, I believe. That's Andrew. And then my two kids are the youngest. We have my 7-year-old and my 2-year-old. She's all every day. Wakes first thing she's like, how many days till Christmas, Dad? How many days till Christmas, Dad? So she'll be spoiled. My 2-year-old last year when he was like last year when that's exactly how it should be. So my son, who was 1.5 last year, had zero interest in opening presents. Like you would give it to him, he just put it down and walk away. So literally, we were like a week after Christmas, we couldn't get him to open his present. So like, all right, we're just gonna open it for him now, kid. Like we can't have these sitting here wrapped for like 2 weeks. He doesn't want to open them. So we're hoping that he gets a little bit more into it this year, or 2.5, and is kind of like more ready to go.
And then when you did open them, he played with the boxes, not the toys inside of them, right?
Oh no! Last year on Christmas morning, we gave him all these presents. Didn't care. He was literally in the kitchen playing with the pots and pans out of the cabinet for an hour and a half. Like not even. I put a picture of him on my Instagram. Like you can't make it up.
Yeah, no, you can't. Well, it's and you're not alone. I'm sure, like a lot of the guys and girls watching the show. I mean, I remember when my daughter was young, hordes of presents. For 2.5 days, she played with the chapstick that was in her stocking. So I mean, that's the way it goes.
It is. Tony, Merry Christmas, my friend. Happy Hanukkah. Merry Christmas to all you guys out there. Happy holidays if you celebrate something else. Thanks for being with us, everybody. Enjoy your holidays. Again, this will be airing on Thursday. Enjoy your NFL weekend. Enjoy your college football playoffs. New Year's Eve and New Year's Day next Tuesday and Wednesday. And then again, we'll be back with draft season next Thursday as you review round 2 of the college football playoffs and also some of the other bowl games as well. And then we only have 4 games left after that, Tony, and 3 games left rather, and we'll be ready to go for the pre-draft process, which will take us for a couple months. And then before you know, we're going to blink. It's going to be April, and we're going to be in the final stretch run.
After that national championship game, it's barely a week later, and we're on our way to Frisco, Texas for 3 days of practice for the Shrine Bowl. And then after the 3rd day of practice from the Shrine Bowl, you get on a plane, you hop over to Mobile. It's 3 days of practice at the Senior Bowl, which is always a busy but fun trip.
Yeah, can't wait. It's going to be a lot of fun. Tony, have fun, my friend. I appreciate it. Enjoy your holidays.
Same to you and your family, John.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, Tony. Merry Christmas to everybody out there. Happy Hanukkah and all that good stuff. Thanks for being with us on draft season, brought to you by Moody's. We'll see you next time, everybody.